Taylor Mendoza, if we could phase out your lovely elevator music, please. Gentle fade, love that. Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's Clued Up Employers Club. So I'm Joseph Williams, your host and the founding CEO and mad scientist in chief of Clue. We are an AI for good and impact organization focused on unlocking the potential of every person. For those who can't see me, I am a practically translucent red-haired person with round glasses. I am wearing a bright green shirt with a blue gilet, and I'm joining from my hybrid greenhouse, kennel, and home office, although you can't see that anymore, as after about 5 years, we've finally cracked how to do Teams backgrounds. Very much a version 1. Let us know what you think in the chat. So a quick housekeeping note. We are recording the panel discussion today, but our Q&A will be kept to Chatham House to maintain an open, safe space to discuss things freely. We haven't had any requests for BSL, so that's not been provided, but if you do need any other accessibility support, Kaylin Mendoza and Pat Price-Bullock are both in the chat function. You can reach out to them and we'll do our best to assist you from here. We'll also be sharing a recording with captions tomorrow if anybody is struggling with audio. So just to reiterate that none of the subject matter covered today constitutes legal advice. And if you do have any specific concerns, you should contact your legal representative, or of course, feel free to reach out to any of our lovely panelists privately. I should quickly stipulate Ryan not being a legal professional, but Victorian being so. You've probably given some good advice. I did mention that I'm in a kennel, so sorry that the dogs have now decided to start barking incredibly loudly. We will provide everyone's details after the webinar. So just to check that it is still audible and the dogs aren't making too much noise for you to be able to continue hearing me. All good? I will continue. Beautiful. So today's session is called The Legal Changes Every TA and HR Professional Should Know About. So as you probably guessed, we're going to be diving into some of the significant changes that are coming about in the legal landscape that will impact recruitment and employment practices across the UK and the EU. New regulations, notably the EU AI Act and the UK Employment Rights Bill, are reshaping compliance requirements with stricter demands around fairness, transparency, and above all else, worker protections. Companies are facing a bit of a compliance mind the gap moment where standardization, auditability, inclusiveness, and accuracy are now more essential than ever. And we're shifting away from do we just have enough people to get things moving, and are we looking after people in the best way possible, to do we actually have the right person doing the right thing in the right way? Fortunately, as we've seen consistently through our research at Clue and in the Clueniverse, these outcomes are exactly what skills-based hiring offers, which is why we're so committed to advancing this approach and research and theory around the benefits to business from this approach. So a little bit of background on that. Clue was founded to improve the economic mobility of 100 million people by building a universal language of skills. After 5 years of research and development, we are really proud to say that we've created a number of game-changing toolkits that are nudging us closer and closer to creating this fairer, more empowered workforce that is also actually now more compliant as a result of this work. Albeit we are only about 0.05% of our way toward that target, but we are on a mission. In our latest research, Act Now or Pay Later, we analysed the most significant risks that are facing mid to enterprise-sized organisations under these new framework proposals. The numbers are really quite striking, especially when we started looking at the economic cases for what impacts this could have on budgets. Current standards in hiring, we found, could expose organisations to between 30 and 50% increases in HR budgets. This is largely due to potential regulatory fines. Just for reference, the EU AI Act is being cited as having like double the size of a fine of a GDPR breach. And so if you then get GDPR breach on top of the EU AI Act breach, then you're in for a little bit of a predicament. On top of that as well, legal settlement fees, and of course productivity and replacement costs, and an expanded categorization of communities that these could be affected by these changes. So when we tried to account that into a number, it was looking at roughly FTSE 100 could be looking at in excess of 23 million per month in productivity, additional budget, and additional costs. So it's not something to really ignore. But there is a notable opportunity that comes with these changes, and I think Ryan put it best when saying it's kind of like a solid and undisputable business case for change. So in the important and immortal words of Victoria, this is now the time to plan, not to panic. And with that, I would love to turn to our panel and introduce yourselves. Hi, everyone. So Victoria, coming to you first, as I can see you underneath me on the screen. It would be great if you could share an introduction to yourself, a little bit about your background, and a simple visual description for those that can't see you as well.
Yeah, no problem. Nice to meet you all. So my name is Victoria. I am an employment lawyer and HR professional. I actually started my career as an operational leader, though, in the military. So I started in operational work and then moved over to employment law and HR. And as has been said, a lot going on at the moment. So for those who cannot see me, you're lucky. No, so I am a white woman with mad brown curly hair, often tied up because I don't like having it in my face. I am wearing a light blue jumper and I hope I will be smiling throughout this session.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Victoria. And Ryan.
Hi, everybody. I'm, I suppose, the talent acquisition expert that I've been called to, but I'll leave that expert analysis or kind of review in the capable hands of you, our audience. I've been in TA or hiring for about 20 years in various different guises and across multiple organizations. And in multiple different roles, ranging from operations to strategy, and then laterally to kind of like into global leadership roles and lots of transformation activity. I think the key thing I'm really interested at the moment is really diving into where we can use AI to really help recruitment be much more precise and actually much more equitable in the hiring process, and obviously speed things up. I think we're at the precipice of this, and we'll obviously cover some of that in the conversation later on. As you'll hear, I'm Irish by descent, although fairly soft. I think I'm losing that accent. And for those that cannot see me, I'm a white male with very little hair. So I would obviously say Bruce Willis in his later stages. And I'm wearing square framed glasses.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ryan. Thanks for joining us. Kevin.
So I'm a recovering lawyer because I've reclaimed my soul. But I actually now work as an independent legal consultant, specializing in corporate and commercial work. I've lived all around the world doing that, both in private practice and in-house, and now helping startups, SMEs, and scale-ups with their sort of legal needs. For those who can't see me, I'm a South Asian, I guess, salt and pepper hair, beard. I'm wearing a black, I don't know, what do you call this? Patagonia top. I don't know what's it called. Yeah, that's me.
Transitions from the corporate world to the scale-up world and inherits Patagonia over jacket.
I had it in the corporate world.
Well.
I did have it in the corporate world.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you all for joining us. Really excited for today's discussion. So let's jump in. So starting with all things AI. In recent years, as people and talent teams have come under an increased strain by being significantly under-resourced and scaled back quite significantly in some organizations, the role of AI in modern hiring practices has absolutely skyrocketed, and rightly so. It can save huge amounts of time. It's become an integral part of the process. I think in our research, we found about 65% of organizations that we spoke to have integrated it into their hiring processes in some way. But is it potential that this bubble could look like it's about to start bursting as tools like ChatGPT do come under increasing regulatory scrutiny, particularly when we're looking at human-determined outcomes? Ryan, you found some really exciting ways that TA teams can balance notions and kind of risk and reservation around anti-discrimination and how you kind of like embed bad practice through AI, and other kind of legal requirements with AI tools in recruitment. What have you seen working?
Yeah, look, I think it's, I think my general belief around AI is that it's about bringing an AI in hiring, just to give that context, is about bringing precision, fairness, and speed to the hiring processes. And I've kind of almost got a 5-point plan. Like when I get to talk to clients and we're starting to talk about how do we integrate AI into it, I think the starting point is really like, let's really be clearly definitive around our anti-discrimination parameters. Let's start to understand what the systems are either we're buying in or that we're going to build, because I think we're at that precipice now where organizations are looking at either building their own GPT models, which has got a huge amount of risk, sticking a lot of data, unknowingly onto like an OpenAI platform, would be horrendous for some organizations. So understanding what your perimeters are is definitely that. Number 2 is definitely look at now implementing AI with human oversight. I just don't think we are at that point yet. We will get there, but at that point yet where, AI should, where I see AI should be supporting, not replacing, definitely in the decision-making process, right? Because we've got so much nuance assessments, it's essential to have that human oversight that sits in with there. Definitely audit, number 3, audit and evaluate AI regularly. We've got a very brief example would be what we call semantic drift, because there's only so many tokens or characters that these models can understand. So the more you use them, the less they remember and the more then they tend to drift. And then you'll start to see you drifting. Definitely if you've got data sets that are trained on unbiased stuff, you'll get a semantic drift into some of that stuff. So you've definitely got to audit and regulate. And again, that comes back to the human piece on top of that. Educate and train your team. I think that's one thing that I think we're struggling with a little bit at the moment. As I see, again, we can see the opportunities that are sitting with AI, but I don't feel that we're taking a step back to really educate the teams on how to integrate those. What are the next steps? And actually even kind of, socializing people with the tools and how they would want to do that. And I've been banging on about prompt engineering for months, but that's a really great place for everybody to start. And then the thing that I'm really excited about, which I think, is what is here, is that the ability to use AI to focus on skills-based and objective assessment design, being able to really use that to AI as a tool to get in there, because you can then, prompt it or instruct it to be very specific in minimalizing some of the biases that you see in recruitment. So ultimately, look, I'm looking at AI as a tool to enhance diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. I'm also seeing that this could be the holy grail for TA finally. We've never really been good at automating processes, or the technology has never really been that advanced to help us if we look at all the legacy ATS systems we have to deal with. And I think now we're on a really great precipice where we can go, right, let's move forward with this, and not be a doomslayer. It's going to replace our jobs. I think actually we can use it now to forge what the future of our work should look like.
Absolutely, and right, something that you've touched on previously is around this piece of what AI could be and could do for teams, but then the resistance and the internal resistance in adoption within organizations and the kind of barriers that creates. What do you think is holding back, say that 45%, or what is it, 35% of organizations that still haven't dipped their toes in, and how can they overcome that in a risk-averse way?
Yeah, look, I think, I would say my thinking is probably a little bit further down the maturity model. So when I'm reflective and I'm working with teams, and if we ask a team, are you using AI? This is where I'm a bit skeptical about the 70% because they would say, oh yes, we use Copilot, but it doesn't really give us the results that we want. Again, it comes back to that education piece. If we understand how to really engineer the prompts, we would get much more accurate results. If we were to be able to understand what each of the models do and how they're trained, where their strengths are, again, you would be able to get your team flexed into the right kind of areas. So again, I think it's an education piece. I also think there's a bit of a fear factor associated with this as well, because, there is the element of, demystifying recruitment. I've worked in teams before where it's very, individuals or groups would have various degrees of what they would see as their effectiveness. So one could be like, hey, we're super effective at scheduling 50 interviews because the KPIs are set that way. Others are, really kind of like, oh, well, we can do our like 10 screening calls every like 2 days, or, you know, so the various different KPIs means that then when you're then forcing efficiency onto a team, you know, even if it's done in a collaborative way, you're then kind of then opening them up to like, well, what am I going to do now with the rest of my time? You know, and most of that means either retraining or skilling up in areas where maybe that's not their key strength. You know, there's not really, they've been hard into that. So it's really, I think it's a really disruptive time for folks. You know, it's really unsettling. You know, as humans, we're not really great with change. But I think, look, I think the basis for me, again, would always kind of start is like, let's get back and just understand, you know, how is it that I can get to know what this calculator is? Let's put it in really simple context. It's a calculator that humans can control. And in some contexts, it puts, you know, like thousands of like PhDs in your hand. We'll never get to that level if you've been able to use them for analysis, but you can be much more effective within that, you know. And I think then along the lines of just starting to think about what's the art of the possible. You know, an example that I have recently just kind of completed was, you know, tech business wanted to have a fair assessment and didn't know where to start on how to do that. But you can then start thinking, well, how can I prompt and get questions to ask the GDP? You know, as the concerns were becoming out, it was like, oh, how's it going to make sure that it's unbiased? I was like, well, let's unpack what the unbiased is, and then let's start to instruct the GPT in order to avoid that. You know, so it's not expecting it to do something. It's like, look, it'll do exactly what it is that we tell us within parameters, but we still need to control it. You know, but off the benefit off the back of that just means that, look, we'll be able to do our work a lot quicker, and I hope it will really promote more human interaction. I think that's what we're really lacking in the hiring process at the minute as well. You can see it, it's a lot on LinkedIn with ghosting and all that other kind of negative connotations around, you know, volume hiring and CVs all being the same and all the rest of it. I think we need to equip our TA teams now so that they can be much more people-centric, you know, much more customer-focused, which I think, again, is one of those things we've been trying to do, but just haven't been able to do quite successfully over the last, you know, 10 years.
I absolutely agree with you on the on there are some real key benefits that I see through a lot of the automation elements of this, which is bringing human centricity back to the to the process. I think one of the other parts of this is around standardization. So bias is such an important part across all of the legislative change. Anti-discrimination, standardization, auditability, explainability. These words keep on coming up time and time again. And as we saw with GDPR, you know, recruitment is going to be one of these areas sectorally and also inside organizations that the regulators look at first, because it is deemed as high risk. And within that, the systems of which this AI is used are also considered high risk. So Kevin, what exactly for those joining us constitutes a high risk AI system in employment, like within the context of the EU law? What are the risks of AI inferring or overstepping compliance boundaries? What does that look like?
So the law calls out AI workplace tools as high risk where the system is used for recruitment, selection, and promotion. Tools for making decisions that affect the employment terms, the task allocation or termination. And there have actually been cases in the US about AI effectively causing people to lose their jobs. And AI systems used for monitoring or evaluating work performance and behavior. Now that there are going to be nuances within that, like, but it's how those tools are used and what they're used specifically for that's critical there. Because there are tools that would, yes, they're high risk, and high risk doesn't mean they can't be used. It's just they are high risk, and there's some certain steps and actions that need to be followed in order to use them, including a lot of transparency.
Yeah.
Yes, plus documentation, plus training. As I think one of the
GDPR all over again, right?
It's GDPR all over. I mean, in many ways, yeah, really is. I was the DPO at an organisation I was at during all of that. It was great fun. It was an executive search company, so that was great fun. The coming around to compliance, you know, a huge part of what we are looking at is standardization. Kind of speak with a bunch of organizations, and every single time the question is always, all this stuff is happening, it seems to all be coming at once. What is the most important thing for us to be looking at? In where I'm seeing a lot of this risk, the lack of standardization, and this kind of, we have certain parts of the process that are absolutely watertight, and then we have other parts of it that are a complete Wild West, is where so much of the both employment side and also technology side risk are intersecting. And Ryan, just coming to you on this, I say without being too biased, but I definitely am. I don't think I've found a single HR use case that isn't improved with skills-based hiring at the moment. But how can, in your opinion, skills-based hiring help address some of these challenges around compliance? We've talked a lot about skills-based hiring particularly, but are there specific outcomes that you think it drives in comparison to traditional hiring processes that can help organizations shape up?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think the one kind of word, as you were just kind of like finishing off there, was consistency. Which means then that, and again, I think it's in definitely with the Equality Act and a few of the other elements that are in there. We've got to be able to consistently evaluate candidates in the same kind of structure, using the same tools and questions, so that you don't deviate and open yourself up then for potential claims of bias and or then kind of misrepresentation through that, as in we're not treating everybody the same from that kind of context. And I think what skills-based assessments does, as you kind of peel it back, means that if we're following a process and we're asking specific questions, we're capturing the data. And again, I think this is the greatest variation I see in all of the organizations that I've worked at previously, is that ability to consistently collect quality data. And it's scary sometimes, the variations of what would still be really early on in their maturity journeys, going through CVs and definitely have a 1 hour conversation with somebody functionally to talk about the kind of job, and if I've worked in if I'm joining a team that's worked on a big FMCG brand, and I'm coming in and I'm one of the candidates that have been identified of working in another FMCG brand, if I have a 1 hour conversation and I'll talk about some examples that then can drive some affinity bias with the interviewer because they're similar what they've done, then they then make an assessment that I'll be able to effectively be in their team. But there's no structure to that, and if they've seen five or 10 candidates in that perspective, the notes are going to be way generalist, and there's no real skills evaluation. There's no real audit trail. If anybody was like to put their hands up under the Freedom of Information Act and go, hey, can I get my notes, they would probably be in the shredder very quickly, from that perspective. Whereas if you've got a really nice, it doesn't have to be overly complicated, but a structured skills-based assessment, and you look at your process and go, right, we're going to do some functional kind of assessment here on how you do your work. We're going to look at your skills around what you do and go specifically into those. There's opportunities even within those conversations to be able to learn something and go, oh, actually, the way that skill was executed within that role actually might give us an advantage in the team. There's a positive element to that as well. And then there's the candidate kind of exchange towards the end of that. Mm-hmm. Having scorecards then to be able to effectively look at it, and I think this is where organizations kind of start to move, where the barriers start to rise up, because then we start to look at, okay, well, if a manager goes, how do I know how to effectively, assess the skill and then mark it up? Okay, we'll give you a rubric, right? So if anybody's not familiar with a rubric, it's what the skill is, the definition, and then various levels, maybe between a kind of a low demonstration of the skill to a very high expert level demonstration of the skill. And then we've got to train everybody on top of this. And you can imagine, all of a sudden it's wow, we maybe don't have the resources to do that. The TA team are definitely not trained in order to be able to design and understand that. Larger organizations are then pulling in the psychologists to be able to put it together, to test it, to validate it, because we're now moving into territory. Kevin and Victoria maybe can help out a little bit more on that if a candidate was to raise their hand and the rubric wasn't corrected, designed correctly, then does it have any inherent bias within that process? So it can be a really complex kind of route to go into it. And I like, my personal view is that, like, you know, as we look at it within TA, we're not really equipped to kind of like go down to that level of detail. And I would say maybe only 5% of the companies I've ever worked in, one notably, like, you know, a long time ago, based in Scotland, it's an insurance company, look it up on my LinkedIn, you know, we're phenomenal at doing that. Like, it was almost ingrained in their culture. It was effortless, you know. And then I fast forward to like larger scaled American, you know, internet companies, which is just like, it's like, there's just no way you're ever going to get that into the work culture. So yeah, so it's a really, I think it's a really complex piece. But look, you know, finding, you know, the right partners, being able to understand the right methodologies. And this is where I see AI coming into this, because AI can help you synthesize through a lot of that to get to what the kind of skill groups would be, even help you with like wider competency kind of like bits. You don't have to go into frameworks, but then really make sure that the questions are kind of correct and consistent, that your scorecard is correct and consistent. And then you can kind of go and explore, right? I mean, every assessment should be an exploratory conversation to be able to pull the evidence all out before we make any judgment at a point in time, which is later on in the process. In my view, anyway, that's kind of where I would see best practice.
Absolutely, and you know, you're so right on this needing to be more than a TA problem, as so many of these when GDPR, when the Equality Act, when increased regulation, if you're in a regulated FCA regulation saying now we're going to do these things, while hiring managers saying no, we can't be bothered, and we know that's taken away from our time. TA still has to deliver against it, right? And so, you know, one of the lines we're taking, particularly why this is so important to start getting ahead of these things, is that when things go wrong, particularly if it's then going to start costing businesses more, we all know whose doorstep that's going to land on. And so how do we kind of proactively start moving through this is really key. Managers kind of come up time and time again as being where things go wrong, but also pivotal to how we make this work. Victoria, I know, you know, from your perspective, line managers are really critical in what we need to do in the process of hiring and also afterwards. How do you think best we can get them on board with getting behind required changes and not amplifying risks further as they arguably can commonly do currently?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I was talking about this morning. I was doing appraisal training actually with directors, which is quite relevant to this, because we were looking at the onboarding process as well. And, you know, when I started out in management, there was no HR effectively. So line managers were responsible for the management of their teams, and you went to HR for pay work role queries.
Sort of policy launch event on the 28th of November, but I think you and I are invited to, so you know about it.
Amy, she's off now. She's on mute again. So you only went to HR for the odd thing, you know, the odd bit of help, and then there's been this shift towards an HR profession, which I think is brilliant. But I think the shift then went too far, where managers started thinking HR does everything and we just do the job and happen to be responsible for a few people as well. And I hope now, and I'm a big advocate of that shift going back to a better balance between line managers being responsible for people, with HR there to support, educate, train, and do all, you know, keep people up to date and all that sort of thing. Because like you just said, you know, the line manager is critical really to every part of the HR process, including talent acquisition and onwards. Because even this morning at that appraisal session we were doing, HR could not say what jobs the managers need. HR needs that information from the managers. HR needs help from the managers to know what skills they're looking for. All the stuff you've been talking about to, you know, put together the skills-based assessment needs to come, in my view, from the manager. And without that input, you know, whatever you put into a system later might not be accurate if it's been made up by someone who isn't actually responsible for the roles that are being recruited for. So I think that's really important. And time is a big issue. So often what we see, or I see, is job descriptions being regurgitated into some sort of assessment process for an interview or for a job application. You know, and you know, what we were talking about today is how that isn't what we need to do. You know, it's how do we go back a stage, really get to, like Ryan was saying, you know, what are we actually looking for? How do we formulate that ask, if you want to call it that? And if there's a way to put that through an AI-based process with human interaction involved, which also eliminates bias and discrimination, then that's got my vote. Because one of the biggest challenges in recruitment is, I'd love to see the elimination of bias and discrimination in recruitment, a lot of which is unintentional. So yeah, so that would definitely be good to see. But yeah, absolutely. I just think we totally underestimate the importance of the line manager. And we don't, sorry, just before I say too much more, we need to tell them that as well. We don't tell line managers often enough, I don't think, how important they are to a lot of these functions, and give them the time and the training to provide us with the support that is needed to manage people effectively.
Absolutely. I think there's one part about kind of calling in, and I do not believe in the notion of kind of scorning people until they do the right thing, but it has increasingly become a bit of an accountability fear when it comes to hiring managers, particularly in hiring process. People do kind of get away with a lot, and that is now going to increasingly become costly. I think even as late as a couple of weeks ago, we started seeing TikTok videos emerging around what the UK Employment Rights Bill can mean for your pocket. And this kind of gamification of information that now exists in the ecosystem that didn't exist. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like really big significant piece of law that affected people this way, Victoria, was the Equality Act.
What was that for? Sorry.
So like a kind of a paradigm shift moment as far as kind of people's protections were in the UK.
Well, the Equality Act obviously was a big deal when it came in. It's been in for some time now, although it keeps having small amendments to it. But yeah, absolutely, a shift change in how we protect the rights of employees and workers, etc.
Yes. So back when that was introduced, social media was around, but it was kind of like a budding thing. Now this is everywhere, and so information, particularly around how to gamify these laws and kind of take advantage of the protections, are also now a thing. And so it is more likely for people to know what to do with them, and also what their protections are. There is another side of this, which is great. People understand the information that they do need to around these protections. But it does then exacerbate the risk portfolio. So Victoria, sticking with you on this one, there is a huge amount of change coming, and there are intersecting risks within this. Do you have a list of immediate actions? So going back to your separation of panic and plan, there's things that are here now, and there are things that will be here soon. And so what are the immediates that you think organizations should be aligning to now?
Well, there's a lot changing in the next couple of years under the Labour government proposal and the Employment Rights Bill. There has also been a few things coming already this year before the change of government, of course, as well. So there's a huge amount going on in employment law. It's been called the biggest changes for 30 years. So definitely what you said at the start, don't panic, but plan, because a couple of years flies by. So, there are things that need to be thought about now, and then, some sort of implementation plan. And I think we spoke about this before we had the session. One of the things that I think is going to be important in planning for the future of the employment law HR landscape is budgeting, and how HR, talent teams, whoever it's impacting, can start thinking about what the cost of any help they need is and how they get that into business plans approved by organisations. Because as a profession, we're not brilliant at doing that. We're not brilliant at making business cases for investment, as much as other departments might be. But it might be now, that's one of the things we need to start thinking about when we look at what changes are coming in. How much is this going to cost the business, and when do I need to start putting in my bids, if you like, for funding, for want of a better term, because you might need some support and investment to get some of these things planned for, even if that is line management training, which again, education and training has been mentioned quite a few things. That's going to be absolutely critical, I think, over the next couple of years in particular, that there is a lot of education and training going on in the workplace for everybody, but in particular managers and leaders. I suppose there's so many changes coming up. I'll just pick up a few. The biggest one relating to talent acquisition would be the day one unfair dismissal rights. So that's going to touch on what you said earlier about let's aim for getting the right people in the right jobs in the first place, not get someone in a job and then decide within the first 2 years if they are the right person or not. I know there are some exceptions, of course, to the 2-year rule, but generally, if you are in an ordinary unfair dismissal scenario, you've got 2 years effectively to decide if that person is the right person for the job. That will change. So by autumn 2026, every employee will have the right to claim unfair dismissal from day one of employment, not before employment, from day one of employment. And that's going to, I've got some figures, I think they said there'll be about 9 million people who will have that right in the UK. There will be a 9-month, we think, period where there are a couple of ways to dismiss people fairly, which doesn't involve going through the full-blown dismissal process that we know at the moment. We're waiting for the details of that, but it will be in relation to things like capability and conduct, not redundancy, or even other things. We don't really know all the details yet. So it's going to get a bit confusing as well for talent acquisition in particular, again, because you're going to hire people from day one, they're going to have the right to unfair dismissal. Then there's going to be this light touch 9-month statutory period where you can potentially dismiss people with limited risk or less risk, let's say. That might not be the same as your probation periods, which are different, and may attract a different notice period and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of thinking to be done around what organisations are going to do to either align those timescales and processes or have separate processes running alongside each other. So that's definitely one to bear in mind. For bigger organisations, another big one being talked about at the moment is fire and rehire. I don't know if anyone has used that process, but at the moment, in theory, if you need to make a change to a contract and you can't get people's consent, then there is the ability to go through a process to fire people, then offer them re-engagement on nearly the same terms straight away after their dismissal, which means you can make wholesale changes to contracts of employment with limited risk. But that will go completely. And then the only way you'll be able to alter employees' contracts of employment will be through the variation clauses in their contracts, which are limited, or by consent. So that's going to have a really big impact. So again, going back to recruitment, have you got the right terms? Have you got people working in the way you need them to? Have you thought about the future? Because it will be hard to change it, especially if it's going to affect quite a few people. You may be able to negotiate consent with a couple of people, but when you want to change something, say 50, 60 people, it's going to get a lot harder. So there's this flexible working, which has already come in as a day one right. So you're hiring people on one set of terms and conditions, and then from day one, they have the right to request flexible working. That's here already, and they can have 2 requests per year. What will change under the Employment Rights Bill is that it will be harder to say no to that request. Okay, so the actual number of times they can make the request, the process, the grounds for refusal will stay the same, but it'll be harder to say no. So again, we have to know that risk could come. So you've planned your work, all your workforce planning has been done around a role for a certain type of hours or type of contract working arrangement. Someone could come in and then they could ask to change it. That doesn't mean you have to say yes, but you do have to go through a process to say no. I can go on.
Well,
There's many more.
I think could play into that, Victoria. So Demi has asked, have you got any around the right to switch off coming in? Because I think, is it France have this?
France, Ireland. No, that seems to have disappeared at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Demi, I hope that. Yeah, quite. Look, it sounds expensive, right? So this is just like it's more and more things to consider, and kind of going back to documentation, explainability, etc. All of these things intersect so much in how we solve these problems. Kevin, we've talked about cost implication and non-compliance, being something that has to be taken seriously. It is in line with the kind of the severity of GDPR. How can companies start preparing financially? HR teams start preparing for this. We touched on the need for building cases. What kind of cases need to be or should be being thought about under new regulations?
So like GDPR, I think my experience, a lot of people either went out and spent a lot of money gold plating, but without looking at what they already had. And then I had a really gold plated GDPR process, but wasn't right for the company. And then there's other companies that left it at the last minute and then were rushing and paying lawyers were making a lot of money at that time, basically helping companies set up when you could, for the most part, do a lot of it yourself. So my recommendations would be start with an audit of what you have, what's in place. Both like this applies even for the employment stuff coming in. Like what are you doing? How does it work? And where are the gaps? And looking at technology and AI technology, it again applies the same thing. Do an audit of what you currently have, what you're looking at getting. So the HR team should be looking at ways to the improvements they're seeking for and the tools that can deliver that, and make an assessment on those tools. I recommend, like I know Victoria said, HR is not great at doing business cases, so it's always good to go and chat to the CFO or the head of finance to become best friends to get their buy-in, but ultimately get them to help you. With the technology side, it's go and speak to the CTO or CIO, whoever's responsible for buying and purchasing and overseeing the organization's technology and infrastructure. Go and speak to them because they're going to be the best place, and people with the knowledge and their teams are going to have the skill sets to help with doing the audits. And look at your processes as well, and where can the tools be used to improve the processes, and then the types of tools that are available to do that, because then the next stage is then assessing those tools to ensure that they themselves are compliant, or get in a statement when if you're going to purchase those tools in your contracts, you'll have those statements that they are compliant with EU AI Act, or anything else that may come in. Document this. You need an audit trail that you've done this work, so you document it, create workflows and processes from this. Again, it's all about good documentation, putting that in place, put together, and you'll need to work with a variety of stakeholders, a governance framework, because ultimately, even though some of these things will be coming in through HR, they're going to touch the employees at different stages and different parts of the business. So you need to get stakeholder approval. So building a governance framework around the use of AI tools in HR, and how they're going to be used and what they're going to be used for. Then it's about training. You've got to train all your employees on it. They often say, often you get the tone from the top thing. I know we talked about the line managers. Tone from the top's great. It's like, but it's not your get out of jail card. Like, you have to deliver and ensure the messaging goes down into that middle management, the line managers, who then have to push it down into their organization. So it's a staged process, but it takes time. But you need to be rigorous with that process. Apart from just training on the systems and teaching the organizations the systems that you use, it's also important to tell them the implications of those systems. So like, use of AI, like I get told all the time that my job's redundant now because ChatGPT can be a lawyer, but I'm yet to find ChatGPT beat me once. It's just speed, but AI in and of itself is creating fear, like people losing jobs because of AI. AI is replacing. So I think you have to be transparent of why you're using AI. And for the most part, the HR processes, it's not to replace people, it's to improve the processes. So you're getting the best talent coming into the organization and being retained in the organization and growing within the organization. And that's ultimately the message. And that's the preface of probably where you should be building your technology capability to improve the HR functions. You can consider a sort of fundamental rights impact assessment. So it's a much deeper sort of assessment. I think it's a bit too much. You got a hand up there.
Halen,
this is just for after. It's a question that I think follows on quite nicely from what you're talking about. So carry on.
Yeah, I agree.
And then there's a so obviously for the UK, like for the UK employers, like you may not always, you're not necessarily going to be caught by the EIA Act, except if you're hiring, if you've got operations outside of the UK in Europe, then you're going to get caught by it because you've got employees there. So if your headquarters there, it's going to apply. In that situation, you're better having an organizational view because it's really hard to segment. And having tried to work with, like, you know, GDPR, bringing that in, and we looked at, oh, do we do something different in the UK and elsewhere in our organization to what we did in Europe? And then we found, like, negotiating with the German Works Council was the worst thing in the world. And we couldn't even put a phone system in. Literally, we couldn't put a phone system in because it had their names come up on it, and it was just like, it was a nightmare. So we decided to we'll just do a global standard and we get the buy-ins. But so that's my recommendation, is go on a global standard rather than piecemealing it because of the Act. But if you're hiring, even if you don't have operations there, if you're hiring and you take applications from the EU, then you're cool. So you've got to be wary about that because the fines are huge. And like GDPR and even the UK Bribery Act, for instance, like they have extraterritorial application. So just because you're here and we're not in the EU, you're very likely to get caught up in with it anyway.
I mean, very thorough, Kevin. Appreciate that. So I think it's auditing, understanding who your stakeholder group is, basically getting quorum, and then documenting any decisions around HR related technologies or processes that are involving AI or not, and making sure that stakeholder group is part of that. So I guess it's kind of like a risk mitigation in and of itself.
It is risk mitigation.
Yeah, but super important, right? And then, you know, documenting everything. It just is this thing that keeps on coming up time and time again. Through our open source tool, the risk auditing tool, we you know, one of the things that we always look for is what's the point of accountability within a policy. And so if, you know, it's all very well documenting things, but if nothing happens, if they are not adhered to, then it's just a piece of paper. And I think this is, again, one of these shifts that we are going to start seeing, is the accountability structures that sit behind these policies and the processes that sit behind them, and making sure they are equally as documented as well. We are at time. Thank you all for your contributions. Incredibly useful, of course. If anyone has any follow-up questions, we will circulate an email tomorrow that has your details in them, and we will continue the conversation. I think just a few things that just to summarize some of the key points that we've heard out today. You know, AI isn't going anywhere. So what we really need to start doing now is getting on top of how we are managing it and the processes and structures that we have around it, so that as new legislation and laws and regulations are coming through, we are not on the back foot, but are already documented, understand what we're doing. So fairer, more human oversight, auditing, themes are coming through quite a lot here. Overcoming AI hesitation in teams, and so not running away in the other direction, but leaning into the fact that this is here, and making sure that we don't fall into panic and paralysis instead of proactivity and planning, Victoria. So high risk AI is HR classification, it falls into this. So if it's not managed well, it is going to push compliance boundaries. It is going to be expensive. This is not something that we can avoid, so we have to get ahead of it. Skill-based hiring is the solution to everything, caveat, bias, but of course it is going to be an incredibly valuable tool in standardizing for inclusivity, for bias mitigation, and of course, most importantly, getting right people into right jobs. Accuracy, it is brilliant, and I could talk about that for a lot longer, but I'm going to stop. And then in preparing for the new EU and UK legislations that are coming in, start budgeting, understand what these cost implications will be if you don't do something to build business cases for what you need to do in order to mitigate them. We've got a couple in our Act Now, Pay Later report. Kaylin or Pat, if you could drop that into the chat, and we'll send it around tomorrow as well. We've got some example financial cases in that report that you can use as a starting place around that, and also making sure that in these conversations, you're bringing in the right stakeholders at the right time. This is not a decision that you have to make by yourself. This is not a battle you have to fall on your own sword. This is an organizational issue. It is an organizational challenge. Make sure that you are engaging your stakeholders in preparing this as well. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you for joining us. As always, this will be up on channels tomorrow morning. And if you have any additional questions, we will, of course, fill them to our panel. But for the time being, thank you all for joining the Clean Up Employers Club, and thank you all for joining us.